Hi, I'm Neil Harding.
I'm Mark Ashworth.
And welcome to Property Insight. So today we're going to talk about the legal costs and legal process involved in buying a buy-to-let investment property. So, Mark, first of all, what's involved in choosing your solicitor when you're going to buy a property?
Well, normally that depends a little bit on whether you're buying for cash or whether you're buying with a mortgage. So if you've watched our other videos where we talked about buying with a mortgage, then typically when you contact when your lender agrees to lend in principle on the property, they will then organise or tell you what's required in terms of your solicitor. Normally they'll want somebody that's on what they call their panel. So if you're thinking about using your own personal solicitor that might have dealt with your own residential property, I would probably just double check with the broker who that the lender actually wants you to use. So a panel basically means that they will have a number of solicitors that they use that pass their sort of criteria checks, I guess, and that they're happy to work with. And then your broker will then approach those solicitors to check with them how much they're going to charge you for those fees. So normally you would choose somebody from those panels. So yeah, I think that's probably what's going to happen during that process.
Yeah, so not necessarily your sort of favourite solicitor down the high street that in the village where you live or what have you, but it's probably going to be restricted to some extent.
Yeah, I found that when I first started investing that, I use the local guy, the guy that I've used for other things. He's a conveyancing solicitor, but so, like for example, one of the big criteria is that they have to have a certain number of professional solicitors within the team. I'm not quite sure why they have that requirement, the lenders that is. But obviously, if you are buying for cash, if you're buying your property for cash, let's say it's not mortgageable initially and you're going to make it mortgageable, then you can certainly use your local conveyancing solicitor for that, as long as you know that they can exercise everything in a timely manner. But yeah, typically lenders are a lot more picky.
Yeah, and if that solicitor happens to be the other side of the country and 2 or 3 hours travel away, does that cause a problem if you're never going to see your solicitor in person?
No, not at all, because most of the stuff that you'll have to provide for them, ID checks, anti-money laundering checks, all that kind of stuff, typically you'll be sending that. You can send that in the post. If it's hard copies they need, they may require electronic copies initially, and then they'll ask you to send stuff. If they've not dealt with you before, they'll get you to send stuff in the post, which can be under recorded delivery, and then everything else is done either by email or by phone call or both, and expect to do lots of chasing.
Yes, yeah, true. So you've bought quite a few properties in your investing career. So what sort of costs can people expect to see and have to pay for, and what's the timing of that? In terms of the start of the process and the end.
So they're always going to ask you for some money on account. And that's typically for searches, so they'll always buy those searches in advance to check they kind of check for anything that's being built in the area, or they'll check for flooding, risk to all those kind of any risks that might be associated with purchasing the property. So they'll have to apply to the council for those, and they usually want money on account to do that.
These are the searches.
And it can be anything from sort of 250 to 500, depending on the solicitor itself. But they'll write to you with a pack, and they'll give you they'll tell you what's required. There is quite a lot of hoop jumping to do, but that's what you have to do ultimately. Their fees typically are for their actual services, and anything between, I would say, 600 to 700 up to 1,000, sometimes a bit more, and then you'll be paying for other things such as the cost to actually transfer the funds. So if you're transferring a lot of money in one go, let's say it's 100,000, then the bank usually charges a fee for doing that, and so therefore those costs get transferred to you. So I'd budget anything up to about £1,500 for solicitors' fees. If you're buying in a limited company, which I think we're going to touch on in a moment with some other factors, then it could be up to 2,000.
Yeah, and the solicitor fee for the actual conveyancing work that the solicitors actually, that's the money that they're actually earning for doing their work. It's not the pass-through costs. What's the timing of the payment for that? That's more at the end, right?
So normally that will come off, you'll get a completion statement. They'll draft a completion statement which will have on there the money that you've given as a deposit. It will then have the money that you've received from the bank for the loan itself. And then it will list all the costs for them and the disbursements, and then there'll be some sort of fee at the end which will be like a balance fee effectively, and that will come onto there. So let's say you factored in your deposit, which might be, I think 100,000 for a property these days is probably a bit on the low side. So say if it's say 150, then you'll have that 150 amount for the house, and then you'll have those other costs which are all listed, and then your fee will be at the bottom, which will be your deposit. But it was going to be a bit more than your 25% value. It will be, in addition to those solicitors' costs. And then we talked before about mortgage costs and things like that, which we've spoken about in another video. Typically that gets added to the loan, but you'll need to factor in some costs right at the beginning of the purchase that you're going to need to pay out before you've actually even bought it.
How about leasehold versus freehold? Because I think leasehold can be more expensive generally with fees that your solicitor's incurring either on your behalf or actual cost time incurred for them.
Yeah, I have gone through a couple of leasehold transactions, and typically there's a bit more work involved in the solicitors trying to understand on your behalf the way that the lease is set up and that it checks out, because they're essentially having to check the freehold and the leasehold information to make sure that it all stacks up. I mean, I guess you probably may be paying another 20%, I'd say, on top for leasehold. I haven't found that it's particularly more expensive. It does take a bit more time, and there's usually a few more questions that need answering. But most flats or leasehold properties are relatively straightforward. You'll always get the other one or two that are a bit more problematic. But yeah, so typically they're a bit more expensive.
Yeah, and it can take a little bit longer on the conveyancing sometimes, I think, with leasehold as well, can't it? Because they've got to ask for things like the packs from the estate management company and the freeholder and so on.
Yeah, they need to understand if there's service charges, they'll need to just qualify that, and just to make sure that all those service charges with the existing owner are up to date and all that kind of stuff. And they'll want to make sure that that's done, obviously, on your behalf. So yeah, it definitely can take a bit longer. Yeah. I mean, flats and leasehold properties tend to be attractive because they're a little bit cheaper and they rent well, which is fine. But obviously, you need to factor in the additional costs, particularly with purchasing, and then ongoing costs as well.
Yeah. I like to use the solicitor that I use wherever I can, because one of the things that they really do a good job on, I think, is they know that I'm buying as an investment property, so they'll do a little bit of due diligence for me on compliance for things like if I'm buying with a tenant in situ, they'll do some checks around, how has the right to rent and all that's been done and all these sorts of things, are all these things in place, which they don't have to do, but it's a nice thing that they do for me, and wherever they're on my panel, I always then use them because I know that they're going to do those extra nice things for me to give me a little bit of comfort. So that's a good tip. If you can find a good solicitor who are quick and responsive and can use them over and over again, I think that's great.
The other thing that the solicitors will also insist on, and possibly the banks too, is if you're buying a property, in fact, that is tenanted, but particularly if it's tenanted like a HMO. So if you've got a property where there's 5 tenancies, they will actually make a charge to check each of the tenancies within the property as well. And the lender will insist that the bank does that. The lender will insist that the solicitor does that to make sure that the existing tenancies that are in place are compliant.
Yeah, great. Any other top tips? I think we've covered everything.
I think we did. The only other thing that I would say is that often the lenders in these scenarios, when you're buying with a limited company, will ask for personal guarantees, and you'll need your solicitor to do that for you. So that will be an additional cost. But it's probably, well, in fact, it's not probably, the lender that is acting on the conveyancing it isn't part of the actual witnessing of those documents and the advice that you're supposed to get for your personal guarantees. So you'll need to engage a separate solicitor for that and pay for that separately. And that's when you'd use somebody more local, because it's likely that you'll actually need to go face to face. If you've done it 1 or 2 times before with the same solicitor, they might do it over a Zoom call if they know you and they've met you before. But if it's your first time, you'll need to factor in that you'll need to go and visit them. So you probably want to be choosing someone that's fairly local to you. And if you've been recommended, that's fine, as long as it's you're happy to get there. And that's for, as I say, it's for doing things where you have to make, or the lender wants you to be sure that you understand the legalities around buying a property in a limited company, and that you as an individual are personally guaranteeing that you can pay for that pay for that loan, pay for that repayment on that mortgage, and you're responsible for it.
And that's all about the bank making sure that they will be able to get their money back in the event that the limited company doesn't pay its debts, basically, right? They will come at you as an individual person if they have to.
They're essentially doing their due diligence on you, making sure that you're prepared to step in if your company. So you can't just like have a company and then go, oh, do you know what, we're going to liquidate the company and it'll just go bust, and then we won't have to pay the loan back. You definitely will.
What sort of range of costs have you seen for independent legal advice for the personal guarantees?
So it could be anything from £300 to £600. Sometimes that could be per director. Sometimes it's less. I think it's going to depend a lot on your relationship with an existing solicitor. If you have one, I would certainly consider that you want to have a conversation with them about that. If you've already purchased properties in your own names where you don't require that personal guarantee and you do have a relationship with a solicitor, it's well worth having that conversation. So if you're buying a limited company straight off the bat, then that's the sort of fees I would imagine that you need to allocate. I mean, obviously it's always different, but don't be surprised if you then find that you've got these additional costs for legals that you weren't necessarily expecting, or that perhaps other training courses may not have mentioned.
But it's a really good point, and one that's easily forgotten, to be honest. So, and the panel that you were talking about earlier. So there's a panel for solicitors from most lenders that you must use, but when it comes to the independent legal advice, I don't think I've ever seen an actual panel that you're restricted by.
No, not at all. You just need to make sure that they are obviously a qualified solicitor, which you'd like to think that most are, and that they're happy to witness and sign it off. And obviously, if the lenders want to take it up with them personally, then that's fine. But I've never had an issue. I've used a couple, and they're usually absolutely fine. It's not difficult, but they don't have to be on a panel. They just have to be a proper solicitor's firm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We really hope that you found the content insightful, and see you next time.
Thanks again.